Chapter 33. Godly Luck. Just as Joseph finished speaking, something strange happened. Call out. A sharp sound of breaking through the air came without any warning. After 3 seconds of silence, the leading Imperial Knight reacted the fastest and yelled at the top of his lungs. Back off. All the knights retreated more than 10 meters in unison, looking at Joseph, who was standing still in fear. It's not that he doesn't want to move, but that he can't move anymore. What suddenly flew out from the fire just now was a sharp piece of an armor fragment. By this time they reacted, the fragments had already been deeply embedded in Joseph's head. The flames on it also set Joseph's golden hair on fire. Plop. Poor Joseph had no idea what was happening. At the time he died, his body fell heavily to the ground. At the same time, under the fearful gaze of a group of Imperial Knights, a figure walked out from the raging fire. From the knight's perspective, the scene looked like a powerful demon that had just escaped from the edge of the abyss. The burn really hurts. The one who came out was naturally Jimmy. At this time, he took off the armor that was burned hot and put on a purple cloak. It was the equipment I had drawn before, belonging to Glory of the King, Witch's Cape. Its effect is to reduce 50% of magic damage of level 3 spells and below. Thanks to this equipment and his own strong vampire physique, Jimmy was not seriously injured. Looking at Joseph, who had died on the ground, Jimmy nodded with satisfaction. As expected, I was right. The magic items on this guy can only defend against close-range attacks and have no effect on projectiles. Yo. Shaking off the soot on his body, Jimmy glanced around and said in amazement. When did so many people come? Just then, the leading knight stepped forward and spoke. Excuse me, are you Jimmy? The attitude is unexpectedly friendly. It's me. Jimmy nodded and looked at the group of Imperial Knights ready to go. What do you want to talk to me about? It is like this. Our Great Majesty Jerkney asked us to bring you a message. The tone was really respectful. In addition to the Emperor's order, it was also due to the shock and awe of the strong man brought by the scene of Jimmy walking out of the fire just now. And Jerkney is the king of the empire known as the Blood Emperor. Are you trying to recruit me? Jimmy raised his eyebrows. Yes. The leading knight nodded heavily and said, Our Majesty has said so. It's a pity for a talent like you to stay in a feudal and decadent kingdom. If possible, I would like to invite you to come to our empire and serve as a general. This is really generous. He speaks like a general right away. It sounds tempting. Jimmy touched his chin, thought about it seriously, and then answered. But forget it. Of course, Jimmy had his reasons for rejecting such conditions. And the most fundamental point is his true identity, a vampire. The military strength and magical power of the empire are far beyond the kingdom's reach. Not to mention the others, just the one court magician who reached the 6th level, Fluter Paradine. Nothing you hide in front of him will be able to escape, and you can imagine what the outcome will be. That's the situation. Jimmy waved his hand and spoke. Thank your Majesty for your kindness. We will meet again if we are lucky. Goodbye. Call out. A sharp arrow was nailed into the ground, blocking Jimmy's way. Then, the leading knight's voice of regret was heard from behind. That's a real shame. Is that really the case? Jimmy also sighed, shook his head and turned around. If you don't accept it, you'll kill me, right? That's right. The leading knight waved his hand, and the 200 knights behind him immediately dispersed. Soon, Jimmy was surrounded tightly in the middle. Even if it's Gazef, he alone may not be able to defeat so many of us. The leading knight raised his sword solemnly, pointing the tip at Jimmy. One last chance, please answer my question again. I don't want to say the same thing a second time. Jimmy sighed softly and looked around with a sharp gaze. Bring it on. If you want to fight, then fight. Although he pretended to be cool, they were actually 200 well-trained Imperial Knights. Even Jimmy felt a little unsure. What supported him in uttering the words just now seemed to be an object in his mind. It is the familiar luck dice. While speaking just now, Jimmy subconsciously chose to use it. He had already thought about it. If the result of the throw was not good, he would immediately use Bat Incarnation to retreat in all directions. When fighting Brain before, I gave up using this skill because of Brain's skills and speed. But now it seems that it is no longer necessary. Because at this moment, the side of the luck dice facing up had big golden words on it. God level good luck. It seems that after being burned by the fire, it has become more lucky. Ding. The luck dice starts to take effect, and the effect lasts for 5 minutes. 1 comments 0 vote. Pissed. Download the app for additional rewards. More events, more perks. Winning you more free perks. Download now. VOIDKEEPER. Download app now. Chapter 34. Zanpakuto, Shinso. I gave MC a little boost in strength as enemy he will be facing are really too op. From the results of the previous uses, it can be seen that the power of the luck dice is beyond doubt. Not to mention, now I have the god level luck. As the name suggests, at this moment, Jimmy has the luck of a god. When it started to take effect, the first things to be affected were the horses under the knight's crotches. A dozen knights in shining armors arrived in the front of Jimmy. But at this moment, as if it was pre-arranged, the war horses were all frightened. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The neighing of war horses was incessant, and the knights riding on the horses were caught off guard and fell to the ground. What's going on? The leading knight's pupils suddenly shrank. Isn't this too weird? Being able to serve as mounts for these elite knights, these war horses are naturally not ordinary horses. They are all pure and selected breeds, and it is basically impossible for them to be frightened for no reason. And now this situation is happening to more than a dozen horses at the same time, the probability is really too low. Could it be that that guy has something that can deter wild beasts? But before he could finish his thoughts, the dozen or so frightened war horses quickly triggered a new chain reaction. They all turned around and rushed back. Moreover, the direction which each warhorse charged was towards where the knights were gathered. For a moment, the hissing and cursing sounds were mixed together. Dust and smoke rose up, and people and horses fell to the ground. The knights, who had formed an orderly encirclement just now, were thrown into complete chaos in just a dozen seconds. What the hell is going on? Looking at the mess around him, the leading knight was going crazy. He has led the team for so many years and has never encountered such a situation. Because of the dozen or so war horses that went crazy first, and the chaos caused by the reckless charging, all the horses were frightened and went crazy. Kill the war first. The leading knight did not hesitate any longer, made a prompt decision, raised his sword and shouted. Keep an eye on the target person and don't let him get away. Of course, Jimmy didn't run away. Just look at the effect caused by the dice and you will know that there is no need to run at all. Under the buff of god level luck, he didn't even move, and the hostile encirclement automatically collapsed. So, take advantage of this opportunity and have a chance to draw a lottery. What he was waiting for was the moment when the dice would roll out the good luck buff. This is also the reason why Jimmy did not use up the points immediately after he got them. By utilizing the effect of dice, you can maximize the benefits of the lottery results. Just look at the last time he fought Brian. When facing the enemy in battle, the two equipments drawn were of no help at that time without the bonus of good luck. Thinking of this, Jimmy glanced at the available points balance. 200 points. You can draw equipment once and props 4 times. After thinking about it, Jimmy decided to draw the equipment type. It wasn't because the points just made up the number, but what happened when he killed Joseph just now made Jimmy realize the importance of equipment. Good equipment plays a huge role in battle. Give me a divine weapon that defies the heavens. Dragon slaying sword, paralysis ring, god armor. Jimmy prayed randomly in his heart, then clicked to draw. Ding. Congratulations, you have drawn the weapon, Lake Toya. Lake Toya, this seems to be a silver fucking weapon. If Jimmy remembered correctly, the sword itself had no power at all, and the protagonist just bought it casually from a TV shopping channel. It is really hard to draw suitable good things in the lowest level system lottery. But having had this experience before, Jimmy was not in a hurry. Sure enough, the system prompted again. Ding. Because of the effect of the luck dice, the level of the lottery item has been increased. Ding. You got the Zanpakuto, Shinso. Ding. The specified number of draws has been reached, and the system draw level has been upgraded. As the system prompt sounded, Jimmy had double happiness. Not to mention the system lottery level, you can draw more powerful things after upgrading. Jimmy looked at the system space and saw a simple dagger that appeared. Although it looks ordinary, anyone who has watched Bleach knows that this is a very powerful Zanpakuto, and its owner in the original work is Jin Ichimaru. Although it is not as good as Sosuke Aizen, Kyoka Suigetsu, it can be long or short, can be stretched or retracted, and can be inserted and pulled out quickly. Ahem, I've gone off topic. Even though it wasn't the dragon-slaying sword or the paralysis ring, Jimmy was very satisfied. Zanpakuto Shinso. The actual effect will change depending on the plane you are currently using. The first form, Shikai, consumes martial arts energy and can control the length of the blade at will. It can be extended to a maximum of 1 km, and the extension and retraction speed is the standard speed of sound 340 meters per second. The length of the blade does not affect the basic load-bearing capacity. Second form, Bankai, based on the first form, it consumes more martial arts energy. The extension range of the blade extends to 15 km, the extension speed is supersonic, 170 km per second, and the length of the blade does not affect the basic load-bearing capacity. Additional effects. Part of the blade can turn into poisonous dust, which penetrates into the enemy's body and causes poisoning. Causes huge damage to soul-type enemies. Looking at the densely packed descriptions, Jimmy couldn't help but smile knowingly. If nothing unexpected happens, in the near future, the world's #1 sword god will be none other than Jimmy Ya. God-level luck is indeed powerful. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 35, Shinso Sword Slash. I stood there for more than a minute, even though I was drawing the lottery and checking the prizes. But from the perspective of others, Jimmy seemed to be standing there in a daze. Moreover, he was standing in a daze surrounded by 200 elite knights. Even if it is the strongest realm of mankind, heroic level, if they were in Jimmy's position. Even if you were given 100 guts, you wouldn't dare to do this. And half a minute ago, the overwhelmed Imperial Knights finally dealt with the warhorses. But for the next 30 seconds, they didn't dare to launch an attack at all. Jimmy, who had just settled in his mind system, was indeed distracted during the battle. But in the eyes of the leading knight, Jimmy's posture looked like he was calm, relaxed and confident. In this situation, combined with the strange incident that just happened, he really didn't dare to take the initiative to attack again. Could it be that his true identity is not only a powerful warrior, but also a magic caster with profound magical powers? The leading knight's mind was full of thoughts and he had a terrible guess. There are some favorites of the gods who not only have extraordinary talent as warriors, but also have strong affinity with magic. Although they are rare, they do exist. Thinking back to the powerful magic flame just now and how the opponent walked out of it unharmed, he felt more confident. Jimmy is a genius who is proficient in both magic and martial arts. But despite thinking this, the Imperial Knights did not retreat. On the contrary, the murderous intent in his eyes reached an unprecedented level. Such an enemy with huge potential must be nipped in the bud before he fully grows up. Otherwise, in time, it will become a serious threat to the Empire. Huh. What happened? Did I do anything? The Imperial Knights were full of murderous intent, and the perceptive Jimmy naturally noticed it. Of course he had no idea what the leading knight Tianma was thinking, so he looked confused. Even if you are a genius or a prodigy. Today, even if it means sacrificing the lives of all the knights, I will die with you. The leading knight's tone was unusually serious, and Jimmy couldn't help but be slightly moved. But I still don't understand. What are you doing? But the Imperial Knights obviously had no intention of giving Jimmy an answer. Follow me. The leading knight raised his arm and shouted, then rushed forward with a sword in hand. One call led to 100 responses. As they charged, 200 elite knights behind him followed closely with high fighting spirit. If you want to fight, then fight. Jimmy had just said this, so he had no intention of running away. There is no need to run away. Like a magic trick, Jimmy stretched out his hand and suddenly an ordinary dagger appeared in his hand. The sharp-eyed Imperial Knights naturally noticed this scene and immediately became puzzled. Where did the knife come from? And what's the use of such a short knife? With the bonus of god-level luck, the Zanpakuto obtained through the system lottery is not just powerful. This was something Jimmy understood after he saw its effect. With his incredible luck, the dagger he won in the lottery was tailor-made for him. Draw the sword and slash. That's right, the moment Jimmy got his Zanpakuto, he immediately thought of this combination. The weight of the sword will not change even if it becomes longer. Combined with the skill of sword drawing and slashing, it is a perfect match made in heaven. He threw away the long sword he was wearing. Now that he had the Shinso, this scrap of copper and iron was of no use to him. The blade doesn't fit perfectly into the scabbard. It seems I have to go back and have a scabbard customized. Bend over, bend your knees, and tighten your abdomen, which is the standard posture for drawing the sword and slashing. The Imperial Knight once again took everything in, and at the same time, his doubts grew even greater. Of course, he also recognized the posture of drawing the sword and slashing. But how can you use that ridiculously short knife to cut? Although he was filled with doubts, he had a bad feeling in his heart. However, the arrow has been drawn to the string and must be shot. The fastest few knights had already come to within 2 meters of Jimmy. At this distance, if they took one more step forward, the sword in their hands would be able to pierce the target's head. But at this time, Jimmy began to move. But it seemed not to move. Extremely fast techniques, coupled with an even faster knife. From the perspective of the Imperial Knights, Jimmy was motionless. But the slight vibration in the air and a faint buzzing sound indicated that Jimmy had finished his sword strike. With his current skills, he can complete the 2 postures of drawing and sheathing the sword within 0.8 seconds. The magic spear in his hand instantly stretched out the moment it was slashed out, and then returned to its original size. This process is much faster than Jimmy's hand speed and only takes 0.3 seconds. All the charging Imperial Knights stopped inexplicably. What? What happened? The leading knight at the front had a bewildered look on his face and he couldn't move. Although he had already rushed in front of Jimmy, the sword in his hand could not stab out. Thanks for your hard work. Jimmy walked up to him and patted his shoulder gently. Move. Move. Kill him. The leading knight shouted madly in his heart. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 36, Horror of Bloodsucking Ability. But soon, with Jimmy's light pat, the leading knight suddenly found that his senses had returned to him. It was because of this that he felt a slight chill coming from his waist. His eyes suddenly widened. No. This is impossible. The breath of death began to spread rapidly from the leading knight in the front, simultaneously enveloping the 200 knights behind him. When? Exactly. He uttered the last sentence weakly, and his eyes completely lost their luster. At the same time, the aura of death in the entire venue reached its peak. Laugh. It was like the sound of something being cut open. Including the leading knight, there were a total of 201 knights. A line of blood appeared on their waists at the same time. Immediately afterwards, there was the blooming of numerous brilliant blood flowers. Puff puff puff. More than 200 people were cut in half at the same time, and a large amount of blood gushed out, instantly dyeing the place a creepy red. No screams, no cries. The moment their brain realizes that they are dead, their bodies have already ceased to function and can no longer execute the brain's commands. Naturally, the last cry before death could not be uttered. Looking at this scene calmly, Jimmy did not feel disgusted. In fact, because of his vampire ancestry, he actually feels very close to blood. Deep in his heart, he was also driven by the instinct of his race. Jimmy squatted down expressionlessly and looked at the look of fear and disbelief on the leading knight's face before he died. He died with his eyes open. Lifting up a section of the upper body by the neck, Jimmy bit the neck and greedily absorbed the delicious liquid inside. At the same time, on the other side of the vast cat's plain, Gazef's face was filled with anxiety as he urged his horse to gallop forward. He was just holding the reins, but his big hands, with veins bulging from the force, revealed his urgency at the moment. After all, Gazef was just a warrior who wielded swords and had a weak political mind, so he underestimated those filthy nobles. They will do whatever it takes to maintain their own power and interests. Originally, Gazef naively believed that even if the nobles disliked Jimmy, they would at most punish him slightly. It is precisely because of this that he has always advised Jimmy to be patient if possible. But what was unexpected was that they would make such a big fuss over just such a potential recruit. 200 elite knights in total. When Gazef heard this news from the border scout, he was stunned. Thinking about his interactions with Jimmy again, he finally understood the key. Was I going to cause the death of such a remarkable genius because of my own foolish and unintentional actions? Without any time to worry about who leaked Jimmy's information, Gazef anxiously applied to the king for an order to go to war, and then he set off. Of course, his opponent was an elite team of 200 people, so he certainly wasn't alone. This time, he brought a small army of 500 men. Because of the difference in individual soldier quality and ability, if he was not leading the team, these 500 people even if they have an advantage in numbers. A clash with the Imperial Knights might not bring any benefits, and there is even a possibility of being totally wiped out. There. Seeing the black smoke from the burning flames in the distance, Gazef's eyes lit up and he immediately turned his horse around. Speed up. The enemy is over there. He shouted at the top of his lungs. Even though there was no hope, Gazef still prayed silently in his heart. Please. You must catch up. As Gazef was about to arrive, Jimmy finally finished his work. He sucked all the blood from 201 people. There is no question of how much or how little, as long as the blood-sucking power exists. The inhaled blood is transformed into pure energy as it falls into the abdomen and spreads throughout the body. While improving your physical fitness bit by bit, you are also speeding up the process of getting through the period of weakness. This is what Jimmy discovered after he sucked the blood of those mercenaries last time. Therefore, after absorbing such a huge amount of blood from a person who had been training for a long time, Jimmy's combat power increased greatly. The reason why high-level bloodlines are powerful is not because they are born with great power. Rather, it is the very obvious, inhuman growth rate and upper limit of growth that are the most distinct differences in the advantages and disadvantages of bloodlines. 273. This is Jimmy's combat power test, with his left eye twitching at this moment. Moreover, the weakness period has not ended yet and the body has not fully recovered. Originally, after using the special skill, atavism, last time, Jimmy always thought that it was the most powerful skill of his bloodline. And now it seems that blood-sucking power is obviously the core of Dracula's bloodline. Atavism only brings short-term strength and can be used in emergencies. What blood-sucking power brings is a permanent improvement. Although the improvement is huge, if you think about it carefully, the price is 200 lives. From this perspective, it is relatively fair. As for the dried corpses on the ground, Jimmy took some from the flames that had not yet burned out. They piled up the broken limbs and corpses on the ground and set them on fire. This was exactly why Gazef saw the burning black smoke. If someone were to find 200 bodies that had all lost their blood, it would inevitably lead to some associations. Even if Jimmy wasn't worried and could just leave, it would be better to have less trouble than more. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 37. World is jealous of talents. At this time, Gazef and his large army finally arrived. Everyone on alert. The flames could already be seen rising into the sky, and Gazef roared again and slowed down. But as they got closer, the expected tense situation with 200 enemy troops did not occur. Are we really late? Although he had guessed it in his mind, Gazef still couldn't help but feel sad when he actually saw this scene. World is jealous of talented people. Gazef silently dismounted and looked around. The ground was covered with red, and the strong smell of blood lingered for a long time. It is hard to imagine how intense the collision here was. Why? Gazef sighed, raised his hand to his chest, and performed a standard warrior etiquette. Without giving any orders, the 500 soldiers behind him spontaneously jumped off their horses and stood in silence in front of the fire. The atmosphere at the scene would have been solemn and dignified if this voice had not suddenly appeared. What are you doing? Jimmy came out from the bushes nearby and looked at the huge team with surprise. Mornings for the Empire's troops. Jimmy. Gazef rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not seeing things and exclaimed. Why are you here? Not only Gazef, but the soldiers behind him also had expressions as if they had seen a ghost. I should be here, right? Jimmy looked at him strangely and spoke. Are you bringing so many people to fight? You. Or not? What? What is going on? Gazef felt that his brain, which was not very smart to begin with, was completely unable to function. He took several deep breaths to calm his mind, then he spoke with great difficulty. What is going on here? Isn't it obvious? Isn't our mission to snipe the Imperial Army? Jimmy shrugged. That's true, no. Gazef took a few steps forward and looked around. Where is the Imperial Army? Where are the 200 elite knights? Oh, you mean them. Jimmy nodded and pointed to the blazing fire nearby. Here they are. What did you say? Gazef's eyes bulged as if they were about to pop out. He walked past Jimmy in a few steps, and braving the heat and thick smoke, he used the long sword in his hand to poke at the edge of the fire a few times. After a while, he came back and stared at Jimmy. Being stared at by a muscular man like Gazef, and with such an inexplicable look. What are you doing? I'm not interested in this philosophy. Jimmy took a few steps back cautiously and put his hand on the hilt of the knife. You killed them all. After a long while, Gazef managed to utter these words with difficulty. Could it be that you guys killed them? Jimmy looked at him suspiciously, then suddenly thought of something and looked disgusted. Are you guys trying to steal the credit? The focus of the conversation between the two is not at all on the same point. Gazef touched his forehead speechlessly and stopped dwelling on it. Anyway, the Imperial Knights were killed, and Jimmy was fine, so what could be better than this? By the way, where are the people who were traveling with you? That noble young master. Before he finished speaking, Gazef had a vague guess in his mind. Alas. They. This time it was Jimmy's turn. With a heavy sigh, a touching sadness appeared on Jimmy's face. They were all there to cover my attack. Ah. Jimmy sighed again. The dead are gone, so don't blame yourself too much. Seeing Jimmy like this, Gazef couldn't help but feel heavy-hearted. They are all glorious and great warriors who sacrificed their lives for their country. Yes. Jimmy nodded and was about to say something else to express his joy. Ah. Wrong, it means mourning. But at this moment, the grass beside suddenly moved. Roar. Following a low growl, a zombie crawled out from inside. In the original work, the reason why the cat's plane is called the Cursed Plain is because this ominous land is very prone to the production of undead monsters. If a corpse is left alone for a while, it will turn into a zombie or a vampire. The zombie that appeared in front of everyone at this time was the dead Joseph. Why aren't you dead yet? While everyone was still in shock, Jimmy raised his eyebrows, muttered something, and strode forward. With a flash of knife light, a huge head flew up into the sky. Joseph was finally dead beyond death. Gazef and the soldiers behind him were speechless as they watched this dramatic scene. He was mourning with a sad face just now, but he turned around and ruthlessly chopped off his head with a knife. Even if he has turned into an undead monster, this is too ruthless. That wasn't all. Jimmy trotted a few more steps and kicked the head and corpse into the fire. After doing all this, he clapped his hands and looked at the people with strange expressions on their faces. Okay, let's go back. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 38, Challenged by Gazef. Gazef looked at Jimmy carefully. He was too excited just now to notice it, but now that he has calmed down, he keenly noticed something. That was the feeling Jimmy gave him, which had obviously increased a lot compared to the previous 2 days. And he didn't know if it was his illusion, but Gazef suddenly felt that. This young man in front of me could defeat me under normal circumstances even without using his natural powers that day. Forget it, why think so much? Gazef laughed at himself. No matter how strong Jimmy was, as long as he was not the enemy of the kingdom, it would be fine. Jimmy returned to the royal city safely with the main force, although this was a great horror for the nobles. Especially Marquis Boulop, it was a bolt from the blue for him. Not only did his son die, but the annihilation of the Imperial Knights alone brought his cooperation with the Empire to a standstill. But for the kingdom as a whole, eliminating some people with ulterior motives is extremely good news. Because it wasn't just Jimmy who came back. Gazef, who went to greet them, brought another piece of exciting good news. That in the kingdom of Re-Estais. Following warrior Captain Gazef, there is another brave and unparalleled warrior. His name is Jimmy. With his own strength, he defeated 200 elite knights of the enemy empire and eventually killed them all. Jimmy accomplished this feat that ordinary people could never achieve. This was also the reason why he was urgently summoned by the king as soon as he returned to the royal city. Amid the envious and jealous gazes of the crowd, King Ramposa III announced on the spot that he would appoint Jimmy as a special class general. Soldiers, sergeants, non-commissioned officers, lieutenants, colonels, generals. Jimmy jumped 6 levels in one go. In fact, after hearing Gazef's high praise for Jimmy, King Ramposa originally intended to promote Jimmy to the rank of warrior captain alongside Gazef. That is to say, it is a position specially set up under the king's jurisdiction. But considering that Jimmy and Gazef's situations are different, Gazef has been fighting for many years after all. Moreover, in the first imperial competition, he won the first place in one fell swoop, allowing the whole country to witness his strength. Jimmy does not have such conditions and background, and there are even some bad rumors spread by some people with bad intentions. That is, Jimmy is not that powerful, but the king created such a false image of a brave warrior in order to build momentum. Jimmy didn't know all of the above, nor was he interested in knowing. The reason why he joined the kingdom army was to be close to Gazef and learn martial arts from him. As for fame and fortune, he doesn't care. Even forgetting fame and fortune, the entire kingdom was dispensable to Jimmy. Even if the system triggers the task of destroying the kingdom now, although it is a bit troublesome, Jimmy will take it up without hesitation. Everything is for the purpose of becoming stronger. But there are still some benefits after all. Now, no matter where he goes, the soldiers he meets will stand at attention, salute him, and respectfully call him General. Moreover, as his military rank increased, Jimmy no longer had to live in a dormitory. Instead, he had a room of his own in one of the 20 high towers outside the royal city. At Jimmy's special request, this room was located very close to the training ground. But for some unknown reason, the day after Jimmy moved in, Gazef inexplicably moved next door. Knocking inside. What are you trying to do? Jimmy had long felt that this old man's temperament was mysteriously similar to that of Billy King and Banana. Is this going to be put into action? If you dare to come, you will know what true philosophy is in minutes. Jimmy thought with some evil amusement. But the above is just casual talk, Jimmy doesn't like it. He was the first one to disagree with the idea that only sissies can have sex with delicate girls and that men should do men's things. Boobs, ass, and long white legs, these are the only eternal truth. Speaking of this, Jimmy actually missed the 2 girls he met in Irantel. It has been almost a month since I last tasted meat. How about finding some time to go back? Jimmy thought of the receptionist at the shining golden pavilion. She seemed to be called Freya. Knock knock. At this time, there was a knock on the wooden door. Who? It's me, Gazef. Are you coming here? You really dare to come here? It seems that today I have to teach you what real wrestling is. Jimmy thought viciously as he opened the door. What greeted him was Gazef's eyes full of fighting spirit. Jimmy, let's have a fight. I remember the last time. It was Jimmy who used the same look and said the same words. Just a few days later, the positions were reversed this time. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 39, Do What You Can. Sir, don't you think this time is presumptuous? Jimmy looked at the still dark sky outside the window, speechless. According to Earth time, it is around 4 or 5 in the morning. It was early in the morning and people were still asleep. Gazef was the weird guy, he came directly to challenge me to a fight. I thought you must have woken up. Gazef touched his head awkwardly and spoke. I asked the new recruits, and they all said you got up very early. But it was obvious that Jimmy didn't get up early, but didn't sleep at all. After becoming a vampire, he gave up the sleep that humans need. Well. Looking at Gazef who looked so foolish, Jimmy sighed helplessly. Although because the anime has a limited number of episodes, there is relatively little portrayal of Gazef. But after reading the original novel and combining it with the interactions with Jimmy these days, I know that this guy is a typical stubborn person with low emotional intelligence. People like him are good material for warriors. But when it comes to how he conducts himself or herself or even as a regent, he is far from it. Let's go. Since there was nothing to do right now, they greeted each other and walked towards the training ground one after the other. 1, 2, 3, 4. Before they even entered the training ground, Jimmy and Gazef heard the command to count from inside the hallway. Along with this, there was also the sound of weapons breaking through the air when they were swung. There are actually people here at this time. I think I roughly know who it is. Gazef shook his head with a wry smile, walked in first and greeted them. Morning. Climb. Jimmy followed him in. There was only one young man in the huge training ground at this moment, and the voice just now came from him. At this moment, he was holding a heavy sword in both hands, standing there in fear and trepidation. With short blonde hair, thick eyebrows and big eyes, he is none other than Golden Princess Renner's loyal guard and puppy, Climb. Good morning, warrior Captain Gazef, and you, are you General Jimmy? Although they had never met, Climb was in the royal city, so of course he knew that Jimmy had moved in. Recalling some of the descriptions of appearance that were passed down by word of mouth, such as handsome and outstanding temperament, he immediately guessed Jimmy's identity. Jimmy nodded indifferently as a greeting. We are now a privileged class, so there is no need to be overly enthusiastic with ordinary soldiers. I am Princess Renner's bodyguard, my name is Climb, Lord Jimmy, please give me your guidance. Compared to Jimmy's coldness, Climb's expression was enthusiastic. This was not surprising. After all, Jimmy was about the same age as him, but like Gazef, he had become a powerful warrior that attracted the attention of the kingdom. How could he not envy and admire her? Another point is that Jimmy Yaw, like him, only has a first name but no last name, which makes him feel inexplicably close to him. At this time, Gazef also walked over and looked Climb up and down, as if to check his condition. After a while, his brows furrowed. Climb, how many times have I told you this? You should do what you can, Master Gazef. It was as if the same conversation had been repeated countless times before, and Climb smiled wryly, as if he was familiar with it. Now that you understand this principle, you still. I know. I know everything. Climb shook his head, looking sad. But as the guard of Princess, if I have to work hard even though I have no talent. Efforts should also have a limit. At this time, Jimmy beside him interrupted calmly. Training at an intensity that doesn't match your body will only be futile and may even harm your body. Of course, if you do all this just to impress yourself, you can just ignore what I said. Although these words were blunt, they exposed the pros and cons, as well as Climb's subconscious psychology. Gazef nodded in agreement. This was what he had said to Climb before. But I'm not very good at expressing myself, and I'm not particularly concerned about the latter, so I've always used the 4 words, do what you can. After hearing Jimmy's words, Climb fell silent. Think about it carefully. Gazef patted his shoulder and spoke. Then please move aside for a moment, we are going to practice against each other. Huh. Climb, who had been silent at first, suddenly brightened up when he heard this. The 2 people in front of us, if we don't count the adventurers, should be considered the 2 strongest people in the kingdom. And now, they are actually going to practice against each other here. Climb's face, which had just been distraught, became excited again. Being able to observe the fight between the big guys up close is definitely a very beneficial thing for a small loser like him. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 40. Battle and Observation. Soon, the 2 took their positions and fought against each other. Taking environmental factors into consideration, the 2 men did not hold any weapons. After all, this training ground is not made of solid metal, and if they are not careful, it may cause a collapse. So, they had just agreed on the way to compete with each other in boxing and kicking. From Gazef's perspective, the purpose of this battle was to test Jimmy's true power. Another reason was that he hadn't met an equally strong opponent for a long time. In short, he was itching to do something. As for Jimmy, he simply wanted to gain combat experience. An invisible, faint aura slowly emanated from the 2 of them. The tense atmosphere at the scene made Climb swallow hard. The sound of dong seemed particularly abrupt at this moment. At this moment, Gazef took the first step. He kicked off, rushed to Jimmy, and threw a swift straight punch. Well done. Jimmy calmly raised one hand and used his elbow to block his straight punch. Then, the other hand threw out the same punch. Gazef's eyes flashed with fighting spirit, and he met the fist without backing down. Bang. After the dull sound, Gazef took 5 or 6 steps back, his face flushed. On the other hand, Jimmy stood there with a normal expression, not moving at all. This is the most obvious difference in strength. And this was when Jimmy only used half of his strength. After all, his combat power points were nearly 300 points now. Due to the racial bonus of a vampire, his physical abilities are much stronger than those of ordinary humans. If he had used his full strength, that punch would have knocked Gazef down instantly. But that was not the result Jimmy wanted. Wow, so awesome. Climb muttered absent-mindedly. His eyes widened as he looked at Gazef and then at Jimmy. Even though his strength was low, his eyes were not blind, and he could tell at a glance what was high and what was happening in this situation. People have been saying that Lord Jimmy's strength is second only to Lord Gazef, but right now, it seems that Lord Jimmy is. Climb's eyes sparkled with envy. If he had this kind of power, he could help Princess Renner. So, it is. Ha 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 ha, pure strength is no match for you. After being pushed back a few steps, Gazef did not get depressed, but laughed out loud. This is exactly the kind of opponent he wants. Forget about testing each other, just show us your true abilities. Jimmy hooked his finger and spoke. Gazef certainly knew what he was talking about and nodded without any pretense. As you wish. Buzz. Faint lights visible to the naked eye flashed across Gazef's body. Capacity improvement. Super ability improvement. Ultra avoidance. Water flow acceleration. As expected of you, you are the warrior captain. You can actually use so many martial arts. Climb, who was standing by, immediately focused his attention on Gazef again. Have you started adding buffs? Jimmy raised his eyebrows, and the combat power tester in his left eye began to tick. 235. This is consistent with Jimmy's previous speculation, and the same is true for Brain in the previous battle. For people of their level, after using martial arts to improve their physical abilities, their strength increases by about 1/3. It won't be that easy this time. Gazef smiled confidently and rushed towards Jimmy again. This time, his speed obviously went up a level. But it still couldn't escape Jimmy's eyes. Fighting intention concentration. When he reached Jimmy, Gazef's fist suddenly flashed with a red light and hit Jimmy's lower abdomen. Jimmy carefully observed the transfer and explosion of his energy, and reached out his hand again, trying to directly intercept his hand. It's right here. Gazef was born into a civilian family. Before becoming a warrior leader, he worked as a mercenary for a while. Natural fighting techniques are not as rigid as those of systematically trained soldiers. He opened his 5 fingers, changed his fist into a grab, and immediately grabbed the hand that Jimmy stretched out. Instant reflection. This was a martial art that could temporarily improve his reflexes, and Gazef had used this technique. This is a good move. Jimmy also gave a positive evaluation. Punch for punch, kick for kick. Jimmy just fought normally without using any skills. Therefore, even though his combat power was several dozen points higher than Gazef's, the latter could make up for it with his rich experience and awareness. The fight was intense. But soon, as time passed, Gazef's attack began to show signs of decline. After all, such high-intensity combat is not a problem for Jimmy, who has extremely terrifying physical strength. For Gazef, it was a bit difficult. But at this moment, Jimmy's eyes were getting brighter and brighter. His eyes were always on Gazef, in order to observe the concentration, transfer and explosion of the latter's energy when he used martial arts. While observing and learning, an idea slowly emerged in my mind. 5 comments 0 vote. Chapter 41. Rokushiki, 6 styles. It's really amazing. Climb had never read many books, so his brain was not well stocked and he could only use the word, amazing, to express his amazement at the battle. But Climb's words at this moment stung Gazef's ears. The reason, of course, was Jimmy, who remained calm on the other side. You haven't used your natural power yet, have you? Gazef said with a wry smile. That's right. Jimmy nodded and said, if I use that, you will be defeated instantly, and there will be no point. Upon hearing the conversation between the two, Climb's already wide eyes suddenly widened even further. Such an amazing confrontation was enough to shock him. But after hearing what they said, it seems that Lord Jimmy has not yet shown his true strength. You're welcome, use it. Although his body was almost reaching its limit, there was something eager in Gazef's eyes. Let me know how big the gap is. There's no point in crushing like that. Jimmy thought about it and shook his head. But I just thought of a move, so I'll try it out. Hearing Jimmy's blunt words, Gazef was speechless again. There really is a gap between people. Just like last time, he only said one sentence and Jimmy figured out the key to the move and succeeded in one fell swoop. And now, in the battle just now, the opponent actually still has the energy to distract himself and think about new moves. Should I retire and him be new warrior leader? This thought flashed through Gazef's mind. At this moment, Jimmy's voice came and interrupted his thoughts. Sir Warrior Captain, please pick up the sword you are good at. Gazef frowned and spoke. Didn't we agree not to use weapons? That's what we agreed on, but you might get hurt if you continue. Jimmy replied. Hearing this, Gazef was stunned. Judging from Jimmy's expression, he wasn't joking. Are you going to use your natural power? Gazef asked cautiously. No, you'd better listen to me. Jimmy shook his head and looked to the corner. Climb. Yes. Lord Jimmy, what can I do for you? Climb immediately stood up excitedly. Give Gazef the sword and shield. Wait. I rarely use a shield. Before Gazef could finish his words, Climb had already handed him the sword and shield. So, are you ready? Jimmy confirmed again. If this were on a battlefield, there wouldn't be such a cordial greeting. Gazef raised the shield in his hand. Come on. Let me see how powerful your new move is. Jimmy nodded, and then. Shave. Climb's eyes widened again. But this time, no matter how wide he opened his eyes, he could not see any trace of Jimmy. In fact, not to mention him, even Gazef was unable to catch any trace of Jimmy's movement the moment he disappeared. What are you daydreaming about, Sir General Gazef? The faint voice made the hairs all over Gazef's body stand up. When did you go behind me? But this was not the time to think about this. The second after hearing the sound, Gazef swung his sword backwards without thinking. Clank. The sound of metal clashing echoed throughout the huge training ground. Gazef looked at the sword in his hand in horror. The sword has already been swung out, but it has stopped moving. There is only one reason for this, it has been blocked. But simply blocking it was not enough to make Gazef show such an expression. It was precisely because, at this moment, what blocked the sword was actually a finger of Jimmy. Iron mass. A smile appeared on Jimmy's face. It's just as I thought. The Rokushiki, in One Piece, originally required long-term training and specific training methods to master. But now, with the energy that exists in this world system, Jimmy can also use it as long as he has the right skills. The principle of shave is to step on the ground more than 10 times in an instant and use the explosive speed generated by the reaction force to move. Jimmy is able to do this by concentrating the energy in his body and strengthening his legs. Not only that, at the moment of moving, he also used the air in his body as rocket fuel, releasing it all out from the soles of his feet to increase his strength. The stronger the reaction force, the faster Jimmy moves. With the application of ki to shave, several other skills can also be integrated. Finger pistol, concentrate the diamond-shaped sharp energy at the fingertips. The iron mass fills most of the air into the muscles. Tempest kick, first use ki to increase the speed of the kick, then at the moment of kicking, draw the ki out from the foot and turn it into a slashing attack. The moon step can be easily performed by utilizing the energy emitted from the soles of the feet. Strictly speaking, there should only be 5 styles. As for paper drawing, Jimmy had not found a way to use ki to achieve it. 1 comments 0 vote. Chapter 42, do you understand? Although it sounds easy, in fact, it is very difficult to apply the 5 styles in actual combat. The difficulty lies in the transfer and change of ki. Just like when you are using shave, the energy should be used on your feet. The next second, I will use the finger pistol and quickly transfer the energy to my fingers. This is a great test of the user's reflexes and usage skills. It is basically impossible for an ordinary person with a little talent to reach this level without 10 or 8 years. Here again, the benefits of a strong bloodline are demonstrated. Whether it's his physical structure or his qualifications, Jimmy is first rate. Even though you are not very proficient at it now, it does not affect the performance of the moves. Finger pistol. Blocking Gazef's sword with the iron block, Jimmy extended his finger and poked Gazef's shoulder. But the opponent's reaction was not slow either and he immediately raised his shield to block. Clang. After another loud sound, Gazef looked at the finger that had pierced through the shield with a cold sweat on his face. He finally understood why Jimmy said he might get hurt and why he asked him to take his weapons and equipment. The seemingly hard armor on his body could not defend against such an attack force. Gazef immediately abandoned the shield in his hand and quickly retreated, looking at Jimmy who had thrown away the shield with a look of doubt on his face. What kind of move is this? Gazef finally couldn't help asking. It's just the application of ki. Jimmy said with a smile. Is this possible? Gazef was horrified. Looking back over his more than 10 years of fighting career, he has seen countless martial arts. But no one can reach the level of Jimmy. Without the aid of weapons, a human body can penetrate a shield made of fine iron. Although there are people like the martial monk who practice martial arts, Gazef has also seen them. Someone like Jimmy couldn't possibly be a martial monk. There's one last one, be careful. Jimmy reminded kindly. There's more. Gazef's forehead was already covered in sweat, and he could barely hold the sword in his hand. But at least he managed to strike a decent defensive posture. Jimmy nodded, jumped up on the spot, and kicked out horizontally. Seeing his scene, Climb, who had already opened his mouth unconsciously, suddenly became confused. What is this again? EHEH. A faint blue light flashed by, which was the light produced when the martial arts was activated. Call out. Jimmy's kick actually created something like sword energy. Gazef didn't dare to speak at all at this moment, although he wanted to shout that it was simply impossible. But if that happened, the breath he had been holding with great difficulty would be released. Six-fold slash of light. This move was Gazef's most powerful sword style. He concentrated his mind highly and slashed 6 times in succession at an extremely fast speed. The 6 swords simultaneously struck the same spot on the sword energy, but it just made it stay for a moment, and maybe reduced its force a little, but it didn't disappear. Buzz. The sword energy hit the long sword mercilessly. Gazef grasped the hilt tightly and used the sword to resist this fatal crisis. He held his breath tightly and his square face turned red. Master Gazef. Climb couldn't help but yell. Jimmy on the side couldn't help but stare slightly. One step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Although it was slow, Gazef was indeed pushed back by the sword energy. It was about to hit the wall, and at that point there would be no way to retreat. Veins bulged all over his body and he exerted force from his palms. Gazef's eyes turned red, and he unleashed the greatest strength he had ever exerted on the long sword in his hand. Disperse. Buzz. Visible air waves quickly spread out, and Gazef finally managed to block the storm kick. The price he paid was that the long sword in his hand was completely broken, and his palm was completely numb. Who? As soon as the crisis was resolved, Gazef immediately sat down on the ground without any image, gasping for breath. At this moment, Jimmy also clapped his hands, walked over, stretched out his hand, and pulled Gazef up. Congratulations. Ah. Congratulations on what? Gazef was still a little confused after hearing what Jimmy said. But when he felt his body carefully, he immediately showed a surprised smile. Breakthrough. The bottleneck that had been there since the Imperial competition was successfully broken through by the burst of energy just now. Although he was exhausted now, Gazef could clearly feel the increase in strength and the rise in the amount of energy in his body. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Gazef rushed forward excitedly and tried to hug Jimmy, but the latter dodged him with a look of disgust. This. Gazef smiled awkwardly and found a target to help him out. Huh. Before Climb could figure out what was going on, a 1.95 meter tall man hugged him tightly. Ha 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 ha, finally a breakthrough. A breakthrough. Gazef laughed loudly and wantonly. Jimmy looked at Climb with sympathy. Even though he was close to exhaustion, he could not break free from Gazef's strength. Tisk tisk. Look at him covered in sweat. Ah. Jimmy sighed sadly. What kind of life is this? There is not a single girl around, and only a bunch of stinky men around me. Hearing Jimmy's sigh, the two of them looked over immediately, puzzled. You've successfully mastered the moves and helped me break through. Why are you still sighing? Gazef grinned happily. Yes, Lord Jimmy, is there anything else you want? Climb said weakly. Looking at these two fools, one big and one small, Jimmy's eyes were filled with even more resentment. What do you want? I want love. Do you understand? 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 43, give me some pointers. However, the prompts from the system finally alleviated some of Jimmy's resentment. Ding. Congratulations on creating your own series of skills, 5 styles, the system rated it as C, and the completion rate is 61%. There are 5 skills, and because the principles are the same, the system defaults to the same series, so there is nothing wrong with it. At this moment, seeing that Jimmy remained silent, Climb came over eagerly. Master Jimmy, is there anything I can help you with? He looked as if no matter what Jimmy said, as long as it did not affect his Supreme Princess Renner, he would do it. Ha ha. You kid. At this time, Gazef laughed and patted Climb on the shoulder. After watching our fight, you want Jimmy to give you some pointers, right? Hearing this, Jimmy looked at Climb. The latter was indeed like a child whose lie had been exposed, at a loss as to what to do, with his face flushed red. No. No, I just want to. All right. Jimmy waved his hand, signaling Gazef to stop teasing him, and then looked at Climb. I can give you some pointers. Is it really possible? Climb smiled in surprise. Please listen to my instructions carefully, just for once. Jimmy woke him up in time. Now, stand here with your back to me. Gazef stepped aside and cast an interested look. He was very curious about what this thing that Jimmy wanted to point out was like. Climb quickly and obediently took his position. Very good. Jimmy nodded with satisfaction. Then, a kick flew out fiercely. Gazef's eyes suddenly widened. Climb screamed and flew out like a cannonball, crashing into the stone wall of the training ground, his head broken and bleeding. Hey. Jimmy, what are you doing? Gazef suddenly became anxious. As he spoke, he quickly pulled out a bottle of healing potion from his pocket and ran over to give it to Climb. Jimmy heaved a sigh of relief, finally alleviating some of his resentment about not having girls. This is the first thing I'm going to teach you. He walked over and looked at the bruised and battered Climb and said calmly. Never trust anyone blindly. Hearing this, Gazef was stunned and looked at Jimmy with confusion. Is this all you can teach? On the other hand, Jimmy had an expression that said, what else do you think I'm going to do? It would be useless to teach someone like Climb who has absolutely no talent. Instead of wasting energy, it is better to give him spiritual guidance. But whether he can understand it or not is his own business. I understand, Master Jimmy. Climb forced himself to stand up and bowed to Jimmy. I understand. Jimmy nodded and walked out of the training ground. Jimmy had just said this to Climb. What I want him to know is that he should not trust his master, Princess Renner, too much. After all, considering the princess's dark and yandere personality, it is very possible that she would cripple Climb and keep him in bed like a puppy. But Jimmy didn't want to get involved in such mess, so this verbal reminder was good enough. In the following time, Jimmy's every day fell into a cycle again. Practice, practice, and practice. Occasionally, if Gazef came over, the two would have a hearty fight in the training ground. Of course, every time Gazef was beaten black and blue. But having an opponent of Jimmy's level to hone himself, he was eager to be beaten more often. Such a useful human head sandbag, and a warrior who has been immersed in martial arts for many years, Jimmy was happy to cooperate. Day after day, a week passed. And in these short 7 days, Gazef also clearly saw how evil Jimmy's talent really was. He was already very strong, but for this young man, his path to becoming stronger seemed to have no end. Today, as usual, Jimmy walked out of the training ground with a normal expression. Following closely behind was Gazef, whose face was bruised and swollen. His steps were hurried and quick, as if he was avoiding something. Boom. Just as Gazef took a few steps, a loud noise was heard behind him. The entire indoor training ground made of hard stone collapsed into ruins in a short while. Gulp. Looking at the tragic scene behind him, Gazef couldn't help swallowing. But this was not directed at the landslide behind him, but at the young man walking in front. The legendary strongest realm, heroic level, is probably like this, right? Thinking back to the earth-shattering move he had just used, Gazef couldn't help but sweat on his face. It was completely different from the air blade that Jimmy had drawn with his feet, which he had desperately resisted before. If it's a life and death fight, it would be impossible to block that move, and I would definitely die. Thinking of this, Gazef shuddered involuntarily. Fortunately, he and I are no longer enemies now. At this moment, Jimmy, who was walking in front, stopped. He had already reached the door of his room. But he stopped not to wait for Gazef behind him, but because there was a person standing at the door. Fred, the bald instructor who was responsible for teaching the recruits in the recruit camp. 0,0 vote. Download the app for greater interaction. You can chat with me about my writing experience apart from the comments section. VOIDKEEPER. Download app now. Chapter 44, Drink It All. When he first joined the Kingdom Army, he almost got into a fight with Jimmy because of a misunderstanding. But now, Jimmy's status is something he can only look up to but never reach. Lord Jimmy, Lord Gazef. As soon as he saw the two people coming, Fred hurriedly nodded and bowed in fear. It's Fred, what's wrong? Of course, Jimmy remembered this bald guy who left a good impression on him. After all, he was also Jimmy's teacher in martial arts and ki. And because of Jimmy's great military achievement this time, he, as an instructor, was also rewarded. After being promoted 2 levels, Fred no longer needs to stay in the recruit barracks and is now a senior lieutenant. That's right. Hearing Jimmy's question, Fred quickly replied, my subordinates and the soldiers have been planning for several days to hold a celebration party. Oh. Are you celebrating for me? Upon hearing this, Jimmy raised his eyebrows. Yes. Fred nodded respectfully and spoke. And there are many warriors who have not met you yet, and they are eager to see you. Of course. Jimmy. Gazef looked at Jimmy with envy. Back then, he was able to rise from a commoner to the position of warrior captain because he won the Imperial Martial Arts competition. But it was also because of this that I had no basis for living with the soldiers, and I myself was not good at communication. It took him a long time to win the support and respect of the soldiers with his character and military achievements. As for Jimmy, it has only been a few days and the soldiers under his command have spontaneously organized a celebration party for him. Being respected and loved by his subordinates was what Gazef, who was also a leader, desired the most. But in fact, Jimmy subconsciously wanted to refuse. He had no interest in celebration parties or anything like that. It was just that when Fred spoke just now, it was fleeting and not easy to detect. But Jimmy still caught a hint of uneasiness in his eyes. He is lying. It's not that I'm interested in why he lied. The only thing Jimmy wants right now is to improve his own strength. Indeed, practicing diligently on your own would be a good way to go. But for Jimmy, who has the system, his own practice is only auxiliary, and what the system produces is king. To use the system, various events are needed to trigger tasks. This is exactly why Jimmy agreed. Okay, tell me the time and I will be there on time. Jimmy nodded. Okay. Fred's eyes were full of joy, and there seemed to be a hint of relief. The time is tomorrow night. Will Master Gazef come with us? Is there any wine? Gazef asked expectantly. Certainly. Okay. I'll be there on time. The next evening, Jimmy and Gazef arrived at the celebration venue, although it was just a relatively spacious training ground. After all, there is no other way. The funds are crowdfunded by the soldiers below, and they are not as rich as those nobles. We have already spent a lot of money on food and drinks, so we can't arrange a place that is too high-end. When the two arrived, the place was already crowded and bustling. Here it comes. As the organizer of this event, Fred climbed onto the platform made of cabinets as soon as he saw the two people coming, holding up the wine barrel cup in his hand. No one here is of noble status, so they don't use goblets to drink, but wooden barrel cups to drink freely. Dear soldiers, let us offer the first glass of wine to the incomparable and brave Lord Jimmy. Dry. Drink. The atmosphere at the scene reached its climax with the arrival of the two. Haha, fuck. Even though he was not the protagonist of the celebration party, Gazef beside him seemed very happy. Apparently, he preferred hanging out with the soldiers to dealing with the nobles. Gazef drank the turbid liquid in the cup, burped, poked Jimmy with his elbow, and spoke. What are you still dawdling about? Drink. To be honest, Jimmy didn't particularly like drinking. In addition, the drinks purchased by the soldiers were obviously not high-quality stuff, they tasted really bad. Jimmy drank it reluctantly, was stunned for a moment, and then. Come on. Let's do it. We won't go home until we're drunk tonight. Jimmy seemed to be suddenly possessed by the god of wine, and his heroic spirit was overwhelming. This sudden change was naturally a prompt from the system. Ding. Trigger the mission, drink 1,000 cups without falling, and after completing the mission, you will be rewarded with 100 points. The reason I was stunned just now was naturally because I was checking the triggered task. And the task was very simple, just make everyone present drunk. In this case, even if the wine tastes bad, Jimmy won't care. The first target to be hit was naturally Gazef, who was the closest. Come. After drinking a glass of wine, Jimmy picked up the large barrel of wine beside him. He filled both of their glasses, drank it all first, and then stared straight at Gazef. And you? Huh. Gazef was a little stunned. He thought that young people of Jimmy's age would not like to drink. And seeing the look of disgust on his face just now, it was indeed true. Why did he suddenly change his expression? What are you daydreaming about? While Gazef was stunned, Jimmy refilled his cup. Gazef, are you scared? This sentence immediately aroused his bloodiness. You must be joking. Gazef picked up the wooden cup and gulped down the drink. I may not be able to beat you in terms of fighting skills, but when it comes to drinking, even 10 of you are no match for me. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 45, Who else? Is that really the case? Jimmy's face was full of surprise. The wine purchased by the soldiers was not high-end stuff, so naturally the alcohol content was high. After drinking a few large glasses of wine, Gazef was already little drunk. He slammed the table and shouted, Hey! Do you think I'm bragging? Come on, Climb, fill it up for us. Originally, Climb was not on the invitation list for the celebration party, but when I ran into him just now, I brought him along. Now it seems that I brought the right thing, as there is someone helping to pour the wine. Come on. Do it. Drink. The two of them passed cups back and forth, one drink after another. Climb's hands were numb from pouring, and he couldn't keep up with the speed at which the two drank. The commotion on this side also attracted many soldiers who were also drinking. Come and see. Master Gazef and Master Jimmy are having a drinking contest. Really? Haha, Warrior Captain Gazef is famous for his drinking capacity. Although Lord Jimmy is extraordinary, he is so young, so he shouldn't be able to drink, right? There was a lot of discussion around, and before they knew it, they formed a thick circle to watch this unique showdown. Seeing so many people watching, Gazef seemed to get excited all of a sudden. I'll take you down this time no matter what. During the sparring sessions over the past few days, Gazef had been beaten quite a few times by Jimmy. It seems that he is planning to get back at the dinner table. But is this really the reality? 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups. This kind of high-proof grain liquor with a poor taste will make an average person completely drunk after just 1 glass. Those who can drink better can drink 2 or 3 kilograms, but that is the limit. At this time, Gazef and Jimmy had already finished 3 barrels. That's equivalent to 15 kilograms of wine and drinks, which all went down the 2 of them's stomachs. When they first started watching, the surrounding soldiers were still making noises and cheering. And slowly, they began to quiet down. Until the scene became completely silent. They stared at Jimmy, whose expression remained calm, on the table, with only one thought in their mind. Is this still a human being? Looking at his still flat stomach, new questions arose. Where did all the alcohol go? In fact, Jimmy is not a human, he is a vampire. And he is at the pinnacle on race of vampires, the original vampires. Neither poison gas nor poison will have any effect on Jimmy's body. Not to mention a little bit of alcohol. Once the alcohol passes through the throat and enters the stomach, the body automatically breaks it down, dissipates it through the pores, and evaporates it. On the other hand, Gazef, who was sitting opposite him, had already turned red on his square face due to excessive alcohol intake. The pair of eyes that usually seemed bright and lively were now dim and looked like they might close at any time. At this time, the 2 of them had already drunk 30 kilograms of wine. Gazef was no match for Jimmy. During this process, Gazef had already vomited 3 times. But he was held back by a desire in his heart, the desire to defeat Jimmy in some way. If it weren't for the existence of this martial arts and ki, he might have collapsed long ago. But now, he finally couldn't hold on any longer. Even though his body had been tempered, and his alcohol tolerance was much greater than that of ordinary people, he couldn't take it anymore. I lost. After saying this, Gazef's head finally slammed onto the table with a loud thud. Before he completely lost consciousness, he seemed to see Jimmy standing up. Holding the wine glass, he and Climb drank again. Can you still drink it? With this last shocking thought flashing through his mind, Gazef fell into a deep sleep. Jimmy, who drinks alcohol like water, can of course continue drinking now, and he has to continue drinking. Gazef was the hardest one to take down, and after that, it was naturally all the soldiers present. 3 hours later. The entire training ground was filled with people lying all over the place, snoring deafeningly. Sitting among the crowd, Jimmy somehow suddenly felt lonely. Who else? But the prompt from the system quickly washed it away. Ding. Congratulations on completing the mission Cup 1,000 cups without falling, you will be rewarded with 100 points. Although there is still one left in the corner, it's good enough since the system has acknowledged that it's completed. The one who was still hiding on the side and shivering at this moment was naturally Fred, who was watching secretly. He didn't know about those who had been knocked down, but Fred watched the entire process without missing anything. It was Jimmy who, by himself, drank nearly 1,000 soldiers at the scene down one by one. Is this guy still a human being? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but hold the wine in his hand tightly. The turbid yellow wine had a grayish tint, as if something else had been added to it. Would it work? Fred was skeptical at this point. Even though he was confident in what he had in his hands, Fred still felt a little unsure after witnessing Jimmy drinking with 1,000 people at the same time. But, as if he had thought of something, Fred's eyes suddenly became firm again. No matter what, you have to go. 0 comments, 0 vote. Chapter 46. Gentle and Powerful. Thinking of this, he took several deep breaths and then walked out of the corner. Master Jimmy really has a good alcohol tolerance. Fred walked towards Jimmy with a flattering smile on his face. Who? Jimmy turned around and asked vaguely. At this moment, Jimmy in Fred's eyes was drunk and he felt like he might fall down at any time. But he knew that Jimmy would definitely not fall down like this. After all, what Fred had just seen was that Jimmy had been like this throughout the process of knocking down thousands of people. He looked as if he would be really drunk if he drank one more glass. This is also the reason why soldiers rushed forward one after another and were then knocked down one by one. Lord Jimmy, I'm Fred. Fred spoke softly as he quietly placed the cup in front of Jimmy. Come on. Let's have a drink. Okay. Let's do it. As if accepting everyone who comes, Jimmy took the cup that Fred put in front of him without any preparation and drank it down. Fred stared with wide eyes, watching the gurgling sound in Jimmy's throat. I really drank it. Just drink it. Why does this taste a bit weird? After drinking it in one gulp, Jimmy smacked his lips with a hint of aftertaste. Of course, it will taste weird, there is something else added, Fred thought to himself. Next. This. This cup has a strong aftertaste. After muttering this, Jimmy finally fell to the ground in front of Fred's delighted gaze. Very good. If this hallucinogenic drug, which is worth thousands of gold coins and made from precious herbs, has no effect on Jimmy, then Fred will really be helpless. After all, according to what that adult said, the amount here is enough to take down a huge monster. After being happy for a while, the smile on Fred's face gradually disappeared, replaced by loneliness. Don't blame me, Jimmy. Fred's voice was low and helpless. I don't really want to do this, but I have a wife and kids, I can't just ignore them. So, please forgive me. After saying that, he pulled Jimmy up, carried him on his shoulders and walked outside. At this time, if there are still soldiers awake at the scene, then, they would see this very strange scene. Fred, he was talking to himself while staring at a stool. After saying that, he picked up the stool and walked out. As for Jimmy, he stood aside and watched coldly. The reason why Fred saw this false illusion was naturally because of the blood of the 200 knights sucked by Jimmy in the last battle of Cat's Plains. Not only did it shorten the period of weakness and improve physical abilities, but it also allowed the bloodline to evolve and produce a new skill. Mind control. For this skills activated by mental power, the success rate of control is affected by the difference in strength between the two parties, as well as the strength of the mental power. As a vampire's signature skill, Jimmy awakened this ability afterwards. What Fred did just now was naturally its effect. By the way, the effect of the passive skill, Elegant Noble, also changed with the evolution of Bloodline. Jimmy's thinking will no longer be spontaneously influenced by superficial things. The evolved Elegant Noble got rid of the previously criticized side effects and derived another simple and crude effect. Possessing the noble and elegant bloodline of the original vampire, your charm will be greatly enhanced, and your effect on the opposite sex will be doubled. This is simply a social tool and a great way to pick up girls. This was exactly why Jimmy sighed before. I have all the skills, but no one to display them on. Alas. But let's not talk about this for now. At this moment, Jimmy was following Fred slowly. From what Fred had just said, he roughly understood what had happened. So, Jimmy wanted to see who was threatening Fred and using him to attack him. Although he was under mind control, Fred's mind was still very clear. Because what Jimmy did to him was just to replace the image of himself in his eyes with a stool. At this time, Fred hurried his steps and soon arrived at the gate of the royal city. As the king lives in this city, there are of course people guarding it 24 hours a day. Carrying Jimmy here, Fred was obviously much more nervous. Thanks for the hard work. Before the soldier on duty could greet him, Fred took the initiative to explain, Lord Jimmy is drunk. I'm taking him to rest. Is that so? Then you. The soldier on duty looked at Fred carrying a stool with a strange look on his face. Jimmy came up from behind and made a hushing gesture in time. The gatekeeper was stunned for a moment, then he understood, chuckled and nodded to show his understanding. It's not Lord Jimmy who is drunk, it's clearly you, Fred, who is drunk. The subordinates were drunk, but Lord Jimmy, a famous special class general, actually followed behind to escort them personally. Thinking of this, the gatekeeper immediately looked at Jimmy with admiration. Although he is young, he is such a gentle and strong adult. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 47, A Stool. After leaving the gate of the royal city, Fred's pace quickened. He chose to walk on deserted paths and looked back from time to time. But because he was under mental control, he could not see Jimmy who was following him slowly. Soon, he arrived at his destination and got on an empty carriage. Fred carefully placed the Jimmy in his hand, a stool, inside and rode his horse forward quickly. As for Jimmy, he naturally got into the carriage openly. This direction. Jimmy stuck his head out of the window, his eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to know who it was. Soon, after a not too long and bumpy ride, the carriage stopped. At the same time, a deep middle-aged male voice was heard outside. Is it done? Yes, sir, in the carriage. It was Fred's weak voice. Then my wife and son. Don't worry, you'll be able to see them tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Are you worth anything that's worth me deceiving? Get lost. The sound of quick footsteps gradually faded away, and it seemed that Fred left in dejection. Go get him down and detain him first. Yes, sir. As soon as he finished speaking, the curtain of the carriage was opened, and a soldier who looked like an attendant leaned in. Then, his eyes met with a calm young face. The nameless soldier's face was filled with fear, and he subconsciously wanted to scream. But at this moment, Jimmy's eyes emitted a strange red light. The unknown soldier's eyes suddenly dimmed. There is one more fool carrying a stool. The richest man in the kingdom, the great nobleman, Marquis Blumrush. He is nearly 40 years old, has a handsome appearance, and is not like the ordinary nobles who have the character of a good-for-nothing. With mountains of gold and silver and being as rich as a country, he should have been living a very comfortable life. But he has been unusually irritable recently. It is rumored that he loves money like his life and is willing to sell out his family even for a gold coin. This is not just a rumor, but a definite fact. I don't know what he has been through, but Marquis Blumrush has an almost insane obsession with money. In his opinion, one can never make enough money. He will continue to work on this great cause until his death. Apart from that, nothing else matters. Even the motherland and blood relatives. Therefore, the reason for his irritability was not the recent death of his son Joseph. As for offspring, if you die, you can just have another one. It's not a big deal. What gave him a headache was that the intelligence he sold to the Empire this time caused the other party to suffer heavy losses. Therefore, in this reply letter, the Empire has clearly stated that it will no longer trust him and the cooperation will be terminated. How can we remedy this? After much thought, Marquis Blumrush decided that he had no choice but to take the risk of being discovered and take action himself. Send Jimmy to the Empire as a sign of sincerity, so that the cooperation can continue. Thinking of this and thinking about Jimmy who was now imprisoned in the basement, Marquis Blumrush's depressed mood was immediately swept away. He first took a bath while humming a little tune and enjoyed a rich meal. He returned to his room and called his 18th concubine, whom he had just taken in, for a lively, after-dinner exercise. After doing all this, he returned to his magnificent hall and gave instructions to the guards beside him. Bring me my important chips. That's right, for Marquis Blumrush, the most important thing is money. All other people and things are so-called bargaining chips that can be exchanged for benefits. The only difference is that some chips are of huge value, such as Jimmy who is about to be brought here. Some are worthless, like Fred who was just driven away. Soon, the guards who received the order came back. Where are the people? After looking around, Marquis Blumrush asked with a frown. The two guards clearly followed orders and went there, so why did they come back empty-handed? Oh, so it's not like they're empty-handed, they're holding a stool. Ah. Hearing Marquis Blumrush's question, the two guards looked at each other in confusion. The guard holding the stool raised his hand and said, Sir, isn't it right here? Asshole. The spacious hall echoed with frustrated voices. Are you idiots? Do you want to rebel? Or do you think I'm blind? Marquis Blumrush said angrily. Faced with the noble's anger, the two guards immediately shrank their necks and dared not make a sound. You. Come here. Marquis Blumrush pointed at the guard holding the stool. My lord, please take another good look. The guard who was pointed out stepped forward and respectfully handed the stool to Marquis Blumrush, speaking in a very affirmative tone. This is the person you asked us to bring. Marquis Blumrush's face suddenly turned red. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 48, Marquis Blumrush. Oh, are you teasing me? He angrily snatched the stool from the guard's hand and smashed it on the latter's head. The guard who was beaten didn't even dare to hide. He just stood there and was hit on the head by his master with a stool. After a while, he was lying on ground with his teeth bared and his head covered with blood. I really raised a bunch of good-for-nothings like you. You're useless. After venting his anger with his hands and mouth, Marquis Blumrush finally took a deep and threw the stool in his hand hard on the guard's face. Tell me again, do you still say that this is the person I want? The beaten guard was still in a daze. Because from his perspective, his master was holding a person in his hand, and there was nothing wrong with that. What was strange was the Marquis who was originally powerless. Now he can actually lift a living person, and it seems effortless. And hit him in the face so hard with a person. But now, he knew what answer he should give. No, it's not that. Snort. Marquis Blumrush snorted and suppressed his anger, saying, I'll give you one more chance. Go and bring the person to me. Don't make it difficult for them. The lazy voice that suddenly rang out in the spacious hall made Marquis Blumrush's body tense up suddenly. As the voice fell, the two confused guards were also shocked. They finally came to their senses and looked at the stool on the ground with horror on their faces. It really is. What is going on? At the same time, a young maid present also screamed in fear. She was clearly massaging Lord Blumrush just now. How come in the blink of an eye, the person she was massaging turned into a strange young man? The young and beautiful maid blushed immediately. And the instigator of all this is Jimmy. In another corner of the hall, he was reclining on a chair covered with soft animal skin, holding a crystal glass filled with red wine in one hand. How wonderful. It's great to have money. At this time, Marquis Blumrush finally came back to his senses, and his expression gradually became cold. I really underestimated you, General Jimmy. That's right. Jimmy nodded in agreement. The serious expression on Marquis Blumrush's face froze. And the maid. In fact, when she woke up just now, she subconsciously wanted to run away. But I don't know what's going on. There seems to be something indescribable about this boy in front of me. She was completely unable to move, and even involuntarily wanted to get closer and massage him for a while longer. Needless to say, this is the double effect of elegant noble on the opposite sex. If Marquis Blumrush and the others were not present at this time, Jimmy would have mounted the horse without hesitation. But it's a really right opportunity in wrong place. It seems that as General Jimmy has achieved success at a young age, and he has become as a bit arrogant. Marquis Blumrush sneered and snapped his fingers. A crisp sound was heard, and two figures walked out from a room not far away. One of them has a broad back and strong muscles, and looks like a warrior character from a game. The other one was thinner, but he exuded a strange aura, so he should not be a weakling either. These two are adventurer I hired at a huge sum of money. When talking about the huge sum of money, Marquis Blumrush's voice was filled with pride. Although he is a miser, he is willing to spend money on security. After all, a certain level of wealth also requires a certain amount of military protection. He was once an orichalcum-ranked adventurer, nicknamed Hard-Bodied Nas. He specializes in martial arts, and his main profession is the monk. And the other one. But before he could finish his words, he was rudely interrupted. Stop talking. I have absolutely no interest in knowing who they are. Waving his hands, Jimmy tilted his head and said, what do you want to do by calling these two bastards out? Don't forget, I killed 200 Imperial Knights alone. Can these two scumbags defeat me? Hearing about this achievement, the expressions of the two people behind him suddenly changed. Don't be intimidated by him. At this time, the calm Marquis said in a deep voice. Take a good look at how old he is. Think about it carefully. There are 200 Imperial Knights. Even Gazef can't escape unscathed, let alone him. Hearing this, the two men's expressions finally relaxed, and they returned to their demeanor as masters when they first came out. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 49, Hard-Bodied Nas. Then, Lord Marquis Blumrush, what do you think is the reason why I am still here? Jimmy took a sip of red wine leisurely and said slowly. And didn't run away immediately. Marquis Blumrush's face suddenly froze. But soon, a mocking smile appeared on his face again, and he said, you are a little too young to pretend to be like me, little brat. So that's what you think. Jimmy nodded in understanding. Okay, then let me open your eyes first. After he finished speaking, before Jimmy moved, one of the two people behind the Marquis moved first. I can't stand it anymore. This brat, who still hasn't grown any hairs, actually speaks so arrogantly. It was the thin man, who had raised something like a scepter in his hand. Apparently, he is a magic caster. And since he was hired by Marquis Blumrush, his rank should be quite high. But since Jimmy had no interest in getting to know him, he wouldn't even give him the time to make a move. Phew. No one knows what happened. After 3 seconds of silence, the magic caster stood up and said those words. He was like being under a spell, unable to move. Hey! What are you doing? The Nas next to him frowned and touched his shoulder. Boom. A large head then rolled off the body, fell to the ground, and rolled a long distance away. At the same time, due to the sudden rupture of blood vessels, the gorgeous blood-red hot spring continued to splash around under the action of tension. Nas, who was standing nearby, was caught off guard and sprayed in the face. As for Marquis Blumrush, who was standing next to him, although he was not that close, some of the stains were also stained on his luxurious clothes. But the one who reacted most violently was the young maid who had never seen such a scene before. Ah! She screamed at an exaggerated volume, took several steps back, and fell to the ground. The fear in her heart at this moment overshadowed the attraction of elegant noble to her. The source of all this came from the short sword in Jimmy's hand. The blade was still dripping with bright red liquid. It was clear who was responsible for the sudden death of the magic caster. With an incredible speed that reaches the standard speed of sound in one stage, let alone a mage who is incompetent in close combat. Even a warrior with quick reactions would not be able to detect its attack unless he reaches a certain level. Marquis Blumrush reacted the fastest. He rolled and crawled to hide behind that nass, and said in a trembling voice. "You. What did you do? Isn't this obvious?" said Jimmy, raising the Zanpakuto in his hand. "Cut off his head with a knife." Hearing his words, Blumrush was stunned. "Yeah, it sounds and looks exactly like that. But how was it cut?" If Jimmy had suddenly rushed over and chopped off his head with a knife, he wouldn't have been so frightened. But nothing could be seen, and then the result suddenly appeared. The unknown is the most frightening thing. Just at this moment, the Orichalcum-level adventurer who had been standing still, the hard-bodied Nass, suddenly moved. Using his clothes to wipe off the blood plasma on his face, Nas walked straight and upright towards Jimmy, step by step. "Okay. Nass, just go up and kill him." Marquis Blumrush was overjoyed and cheered from behind. "Can't wait to die." Jimmy's mouth curled up slightly. "Then I'll grant your wish." As he spoke, Jimmy raised the Zanpakuto in his hand. "Wait a minute." At this time, Nass, who had already walked up to him, suddenly stretched out his hand and said with a righteous look on his face. "I have something to say." Then, there was a dull sound. Plop. He fell to his knees with both knees hitting the ground. He had lost all the dignity of a former high-ranking adventurer and now a gold medal fighter for a great noble, and he was brought to his knees just like that. But in fact, it was precisely because he had been an adventurer that Nass understood a truth more clearly. Even though dignity is important, but not as important as your life. Being alive is the most important thing. If you are dead, no matter how much you have, it is useless. The Marquis Blumrush couldn't feel it, but as a seasoned warrior, Nass realized the huge gap between the two sides in that short moment. Therefore, Nass, who was kneeling on the ground with his head lowered in submission, spoke quickly. "Nass is willing to respect Master Jimmy as his master, and please spare my life." Seeing this, Jimmy couldn't help but be slightly stunned. "Where's the toughness you promised? Do you deserve your title by doing this?" But it's better this way. Jimmy doesn't really want this place to be stained with blood again. Of course, it wasn't a sudden outburst of compassion. But soon, everything here will become his. Jimmy glanced at the system bar, where a new task had been triggered. Above the powerful. Mission content: conquer the richest man in the kingdom and become the master of Marquis Blumrush. After completing the task, you will be rewarded with 300 points. Do you want to make the arrogant nobleman Marquis Blumrush recognize you as your master? This is a bit difficult. While thinking in his heart, Jimmy nodded to Nass and said, "Okay, I agree. Stand behind me. Thank you for not killing me, master." Nass was overjoyed, and quickly followed the instructions, standing happily behind Jimmy. 0 comments 0 vote. Chapter 50, 13,000 meters. Blumrush's face turned pale instantly, and it was unclear whether he was afraid or angry. "So, what else can you do now, Marquis Blumrush?" Jimmy played with the Zanpakuto in his hand and said with a relaxed look. "You. Don't be so arrogant." Marquis Blumrush, who had been sitting upright, stood up and said solemnly, "As a general of the kingdom, you broke into the nobles' territory at night and threatened them like this. This is treason." Although he looks serious, it seems he is just a coward. Treason. Hearing this, Jimmy almost couldn't help laughing. "It was you who planned to tie me up here, why? Do you want to put the blame on me now, Marquis Blumrush? And don't forget, you Marquis Blumrush are in communication and cooperation with the Empire. Don't you think I don't know?" Hearing this, Marquis Blumrush's already pale face turned even paler. But if he didn't have some weight, how could he climb to the position of the richest man in the kingdom? Humph. That's nonsense. You're slandering me. Marquis Blumrush looked indignant, as if Jimmy was really wronging him. "Everyone knows that I, Blumrush, have always taken it as my duty to safeguard the interests of the royal family. I am a benevolent nobleman who firmly follows the kingdom rules. I am a magnanimous man. If you leave now, I can pretend that what happened tonight never happened. After all, he is a person in a high position of power, so he speaks in an official tone. It seems that he can't be defeated by talking alone. But unfortunately, I can't just pretend it never happened. After thinking for a while, Jimmy said to Nas, who was standing straight behind him, "Take him and follow me." "Yes, Lord Jimmy." Nas strode over, picked up Marquis Blumrush like a chicken, and followed behind Jimmy. What are you going to do?" At this time, Marquis Blumrush still refused to lose face. "Let me tell you, I am a great noble and I have my own army. As long as I give the order, tens of thousands of soldiers will immediately surround this place, and you won't be able to escape. Stop bluffing." Jimmy, who was walking in front, said without turning his head. "Most of your soldiers should be at your gold mine and mithril mine, working hard to mine for you." Marquis Blumrush's sweat could no longer stop dripping. The facts were exactly as Jimmy had said. In order to get more money, he deployed most of the military forces in the territory to the mine. Only a small portion was kept to protect the safety of his property. As for the security of the territory under your jurisdiction, to ensure the safety of the civilians. What does that have to do with him? Can you make money if you manage it well? The only purpose of those crappy people is to pay taxes, nothing else. Although I don't know where you got this information from, but since you know me so well, you should also know. Marquis Blumrush felt that he could still be saved. Even if most of the soldiers are not here, there are still 2,000 warriors left in the territory. You are very powerful, but 2 fists are not as good as 4 hands. Can you beat so many people? You really won't give up until you see the dead end. Jimmy turned his head and glanced at him, saying, "That's exactly what I want to prove to you. High quantity means nothing in front of me." Marquis Blumrush was confused when he heard this. What's the meaning? Okay, here it is. Before Blumrush could figure it out, the 3 of them arrived at the huge courtyard of the mansion. "What exactly do you want to do?" Marquis Blumrush couldn't help but ask. Nas behind him also had a confused look on his face. "The night sky is so beautiful tonight." Jimmy looked up at the sky and suddenly sighed. This inexplicable incident made Marquis Blumrush, who was on the verge of emotional collapse, almost cry. What the hell is going on? Nas, help him turn his head toward the sky. Seeing Marquis Blumrush lowering his head in frustration, Jimmy couldn't help but give orders. Okay. Nas responded, holding Marquis Blumrush's head and pointing it towards the sky. See that cloud? Jimmy pointed. Marquis Blumrush had a sad face and said nothing. When Nas saw Jimmy frowning as Marquis Blumrush didn't reply, he immediately raised his hand and slapped him, cursing, "The master is asking you a question." "See, I can see." "Very good." Jimmy nodded with satisfaction and pointed the Zanpakuto in his hand towards the sky. The target is the huge night cloud above the head. Bankai. The second stage of releasing the Zanpakuto requires a verbal call. Buzz. A white light flashed. As for Nas and Marquis Blumrush, they only felt a flash before their eyes. The speed of expansion and contraction is 500 times the speed of sound, a speed that even Jimmy himself cannot reach or perceive, let alone them. Looking at the knife in his hand, it has been extended to an exaggerated extent. If I had to describe it in 3 words, it would be piercing the sky. In their sight, the long sword easily reached its destination, which was the height of the night cloud, and it passed through it. After all, according to common sense, clouds are generally at an altitude of about 2,000–6,000 meters. But the length of Jimmy's Shinso at this time is 13,000 meters.